Good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know there are probably a few people still joining, but we'll go ahead and get started and let them join as they may. All right. Welcome to today's session. I am Jackie Hankins. I'm a senior managing attorney at Marashlian Donahue. For those of you that don't know us, we're a boutique firm located just outside of our nation's capital. And we focus on communications law with an expertise in prepaid specific legal issues. This afternoon, we're going to dive into some tax issues, particularly the complexities associated with wireless and SIM card taxation. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them, and I'll do my best to answer them either during the presentation or at the conclusion. So while we will cover a lot of what is hopefully going to be interesting material, I of course have to tell you that I'm not your lawyer. You are certainly welcome to hire me, but until then, by listening to this presentation, there is no attorney-client relation formed between you and the firm. Moving on to today's agenda. We will start with the basics, so that's how prepaid wireless services in general are going to be taxed. And next, we'll discuss some tax considerations as they apply to prepaid wireless and SIM card, transactions. First, Nexus, that is, when do you have sufficient contacts with the state to enable the state to tax your revenue? Next, taxability, so what's taxable? Third, we'll talk about sourcing, how you source your revenue or associate your revenue with a particular jurisdiction for tax purposes. And finally, we will explore some practical solutions for multi-jurisdictional tax compliance. Okay, let's get started with the basics. This slide illustrates some of the complexities that are facing any telecommunications company in managing multi-jurisdictional tax compliance. So as you can see, a few years ago, it was estimated that there were over 300 types of telecom taxes and surcharges, tens of thousands of jurisdictions nationwide, necessitating up to 48,000 different tax filings. I'm getting a couple of comments here that there's some trouble with the audio, so let me see if I can adjust that. Okay, hopefully this will be a little bit better. 1 second. Okay, hopefully we have got that adjusted and the audio is a little bit better here. Apologies for that. So while tax compliance can be incredibly burdensome, it can also present a competitive opportunity. Optimizing and managing tax compliant collection practices, that is, can give a provider a competitive edge over other competitors that fail to take those steps to optimize their tax compliance. So I will advise, though, that companies should be careful, and of course I'll tell you to consult with counsel when you devise any tax strategy so that you avoid running afoul of applicable laws. U.S. transaction taxes applicable to telecom services typically fit within a few categories. So you have your sales, communications, and gross receipts. And then you have your surcharges and fees. And they all present unique challenges for prepaid wireless service providers. Today we're going to focus on sales and excise tax, or communication services tax. In particular, we will look at the special issues that arise for providers of SIM cards powering prepaid wireless offerings. A few primary considerations for sales and excise taxes. First, nexus. That is, does a provider have sufficient contacts with the state or locality to enable that jurisdiction to require the company to collect and remit taxes in that jurisdiction? Second, taxability. Is the service taxable? Third, sourcing. So that's what, if any, portion of the revenue from a given sale should be sourced or tied to a jurisdiction for tax purposes. So let's start with nexus. As mentioned, nexus is the degree of business activity that must be reached before a jurisdiction, that's a state or a locality, can require a business to collect and remit taxes. So that determines whether a company is liable for collecting taxes in that jurisdiction. There are a few nexus tests, which may apply to telecommunication services. First, there's physical presence. So generally, if a company has sufficient physical presence, offices, equipment, telecom infrastructure, employees, contractors, etc., in a jurisdiction, then it has nexus with that jurisdiction for tax purposes. Again, there may be exceptions, but that's the general rule. The physical presence test generally applies to all types of companies and services. Now, for communication services specifically, there is a broader test. If a call originates or terminates in a state, and it's billed to a service address in that state, then that state has the authority to tax that revenue. That, which is called the Goldberg test, it can result in a telecom company facing tax exposure nationwide. Finally, there is economic nexus. So in some jurisdictions, if a company earns a certain amount of revenue in the state, or then regardless of its other contacts with the state, it has nexus for tax purposes. So while this is kind of seemingly simple in principle, there are a few factors that complicate that nexus analysis. First, there's this so-called nexus for one, nexus for all concept. In general, nexus needs to be evaluated for each different tax type. So your income tax, your sales tax, your excise tax. But if a company establishes nexus for one purpose, let's say income tax, it might also establish nexus for the purpose of other tax types. So that's something you want to consider. There are also unique nexus issues with online or remote sales, for example, sales by phone. In particular, there's no obvious physical presence there, so that needs something you need to take into account. If your company establishes nexus with a jurisdiction, what happens? Well, you have to register with the Department of Revenue, collect and remit taxes. And to do so, you're likely going to have to invest in a robust billing system and tax calculation engine to enable you to bill and collect the appropriate taxes and fees from your customers. You may also need to implement a resale compliance program if you resell services, that is, to other providers. So next up, we will talk about taxability. What's taxable? Taxability varies by jurisdiction, like taxes in general. So for example, let's take sales tax. Some state and local sales taxes only apply to tangible personal property. So in the case of telecom or prepaid services, you're talking about equipment or phones. Some sales taxes, on the other hand, apply to services as well. Excise taxes, however, they typically apply only to sales of services. Another consideration when you're evaluating what's going to be taxable, bundled transactions. As we know, prepaid wireless providers tend to bundle things together. So you have your data, your internet access, your calling, your voice service, and then your SMS or text messaging. And you may also even include an equipment charge in there. Not all of these elements are necessarily taxable in all jurisdictions. But when they're bundled together for a single price, it creates complexities with taxation. For example, while some states, with the support of your accounting books and records, will allow you to unbundle or allocate portions of that bundled price to the individual components of the offering. Other states are going to treat the entire bundled price as taxable, unless the pieces are separately invoiced. So bundling something you want to carefully consider it because it can significantly impact your tax liability. Okay, so let's consider the issue of taxability for SIM cards in particular. SIM cards present unique challenges because they may be treated differently by different taxing authorities. So for example, some jurisdictions treat them as tangible personal property, and others consider them a means of accessing a service. So since some sales taxes apply only to tangible personal property, and others apply to both tangible personal property and services, this treatment can impact the taxability of SIM cards. So let's go to sourcing. This is perhaps the most complicated tax consideration of them all. Sourcing means evaluating which state's tax rules apply, in short. On this slide, we have an example which illustrates how difficult it can be to evaluate sourcing for these kinds of sales, since you have to consider each tax type and each transaction individually. I will read it. I'm not going to go through this example. Of course, try it for yourself, and then if you have questions, you can contact me. So the example we have here is a Las Vegas resident buys an unlocked phone on a trip to Phoenix, purchased prepaid SIM card online from a company headquartered in Houston, recharges that prepaid balance while on a business trip in New York City, and calls his or her relative in Los Angeles while using a phone at a vacation home in Denver. So, which jurisdiction's rules apply? You have the sale of the phone, the sale of the SIM recharge, and the phone call. So you can see how incredibly complicated this can get. There are a couple different approaches to sourcing generally. Some states apply what's called destination-based sourcing, and others apply origin-based sourcing. So most states apply the destination-based sourcing model, where the revenue from a sale is sourced to the place where the product or service is shipped or where it's going to be used. A few apply origin-based sourcing. That's where the revenue is sourced to the location where the product originates. That's where it's shipped from or is provided. So when we are talking about taxation for SIM cards, there are a few unique factors to consider. Specifically, the cards can be sold online and recharged. So you have to determine how to source revenue, not only from the initial sale, but for any recharge. And the sourcing may not always be the same for both transactions. Of course, with prepaid services generally, there are also some complicating factors, such as you have a lack of knowledge of the customer's billing address or inability to identify the point of use, which are things that might otherwise be used for sourcing purposes. So some general sourcing guidelines. For sales tax, generally you're going to source to the point of sale. So if it's a brick and mortar store, you're sourcing it to the store's location. If it's online, it's going to be the shipping address unless an origin-based state sourcing rule applies. For excise tax, it's generally going to source to the point of use, and if you don't know where it's going to be used, then to the shipping or billing address. So let's take these transactions separately. So your initial sale of the SIM will usually be sourced, as we just discussed, so sales tax, that's where it's sold, or the billing address. Excise tax, point of use, or if unknown, the shipping or billing address. Now, what do you do about the recharge? Generally, they're going to be sourced just like the initial SIM card sale, but recharges may, unlike the sale of the actual card, be treated as services rather than tangible personal property. So for sales tax purposes, in jurisdictions that treat tangible personal property differently from services, sourcing and taxability might be impacted. Just a general rule of thumb, source the recharge to the service address, so where it's going to be used, or if you don't know, the shipping address, and if that's unknown, then to the location associated with the mobile phone number. For excise tax purposes, the general rule is to source to the service address, or if unknown, the shipping or billing address, and if that's unknown, the location associated with the mobile customer's phone number. So that's for your recharges. And that concludes today's presentation. I hope you found it interesting or I've sufficiently confused you. This is not easy stuff, so we are here to help. We can assist in tax review, Nexus, optimization work, and tax mapping, or invoice testing if you so desire. And that has my contact information if you would like to get in touch or if you have further questions about the presentation or our firm. And I will be happy to take any questions.